Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you. You all must be lovers of books because if you're doing this on a Sunday evening, it's fantastic. Thank you for coming. And yet another episode of Right Circle, sponsored by Sri Cements in association with Prabhakar Foundation, SAS Women and Spaggia Foundation, and ITC Rajputana. Before I introduce our writer and our moderator for today, I'm going to request Mr. Rana, General Manager of ITC Rajputana, to please come up and say a few words. Thank you.
Quick welcome to everybody here. Thank you so much for coming on a Sunday, and thank you for this lovely forum where we interact with personalities who we read about. Read their thoughts, but I think today is going to be an evening where we will interact and understand what is it that you would like to tell us about yourself. Having said that, thank you again for this wonderful platform where ITC Hotels, ITC Rajputana is partnering with you, Prabhakar Foundation and the Writers Club to these excellent platforms, and it is always a pleasure and an honor to host you. Thank you. Thank you.
So just briefly to introduce Anirudh and Swadhamini. Anirudh is obviously an awarded writer. The book under question is Lords of the Deccan, which is what he calls a new history of medieval South India. And he has received the Tata Literature Live Best Non-Fiction Book of the Year Award for 2022. Guys, he's also featured in the week's 40 Under 40 for India's most promising creators, as well as Open Magazine, well, lots of other things. He also writes the weekly Thinking Medieval column for The Print. He hosts a lot of podcasts. Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
I mean, I haven't been able to host as many since the book was published, but yeah, that's actually how I got my start.
That's the price you pay for being such a star. It's okay. And we have someone very special with us moderating one of the Right Circle sessions for the first time, but she's someone I discovered. I don't know why I didn't meet you before this, Sudhamini, but thank you for being with us. She's a writer, photographer, and a translator. She's also translated Rajkamal Chaudhary's short stories and couple of other short stories collections for Seagull Books, and like Anirudh, she also writes for a lot of magazines, portals. So we've got two Maharathis with us today. Can we welcome them? I'm going to hand over to both of you to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meeta. That was a much kinder introduction than I deserved. At least for me, Anirudh, of course, is well deserved. So, very, very happy to have you here, Anirudh, today.
My pleasure.
And just to begin with here, thank you so much for being here with us today. And as we know that Anirudh has written a book about a region that has often been overlooked. So whenever we're thinking of history of India, Deccan is obviously a region that has most often been quite overlooked. We don't know the nuances of the history. We know a little bit about it, but that's where we stop. At least that's what I found true for myself. So as I was reading your wonderful, wonderful book, Lords of the Deccan, and I found that even me, who I think I like to believe that I'm quite well read, that turned out to be not true at all. Because as I was reading it, I discovered so many things about the South that I did not know, and I had no idea that the history of the region was so nuanced and so complex. So just to kind of begin the session, how do you feel as a person who's writing about the history of the Deccan? How do you think that South India in general and the region of Deccan is perceived in the North Indian narrative? What do you think about that?
Thanks, Swadhamini. That's a really interesting question. Before I answer, though, let me thank all of you once again for being here on a Sunday evening, and of course to Meeta for so unfailingly following up and making sure that the event happened. and of course to ITC and the Prabha Khaitan Foundation for making it happen. This question is quite interesting because as a South Indian, it's difficult for me to speak to how all of North India sees South India, but let me give you one example that I think encapsulates it. Two examples actually. The first that I'd like to give you is from the National Museum. I don't know if any of you have had the time to visit recently, but to me, I was there a few weeks ago and it was so interesting because they have this vast gallery for the Harappans, then that connects to a gallery about the Iron Age cultures, to the Mauryas, to the Shangas, to the Gandharans, and there's this beautiful sequence that goes all the way up to the Gupta Empire. All of these are, of course, North Indian empires. And then, when it reaches the 600 CE mark, there's one massive gallery. Actually, it's not that massive, it's probably around the size of this hall, where you will find sculptures from all over India south of Narmada, from almost 600 years of history. So from 600 to 1200 you will find Pallava sculptures, you will find Chola, Chalukya, Rashtrakuta sculptures, without a single line of text actually explaining what those sculptures mean. Yeah. And that single hall is supposed to represent a region that is almost the size of half of Western Europe, and that has historically been one of the greatest population centers, not just in South Asia but also in the world. How many of us know, for example, that after the Indus River Valley, after the Ganga River Valley, the largest river valley in the subcontinent is the Krishna Godavari River Valley. Maharashtra and Karnataka are equivalent in a way to India's Germany. Imagine writing a history of Europe without writing the history of Germany. But when it comes to the history of India, that's something that we're very used to. The next example I have to give you, I'm not sure if, I was actually very interested at the choice of music that was playing as we were all being seated. I'm not sure if that was deliberate, but it was Vatapi Ganapatim, a famous hymn from the Carnatic music corpus. And I find that song very interesting because it's a Tamil Carnatic song about Vatapi Ganapati. Vatapi is not in Tamil Nadu, Vatapi is in North Karnataka. So why is it that you have a Tamil song about Vatapi Ganapati? Because according to legend, the Vatapi Ganapati was taken by war by the Pallava dynasty of Tamil Nadu from the Chalukya dynasty of North Karnataka and brought to a temple in Tamil Nadu. And it is so interesting to me if you look at a lot of popular media, and by popular media I mean memes, because I'm like a lot of millennials quite related to social media and I consume a lot of information through memes. What I find so interesting is that there has been this trend in recent popular culture, especially in North India, to see the South as this place where true Indian culture is preserved. And that implies peacefulness, that implies high culture, dance, music, and so on. And that's not to say that that is not present in South India, but there's this implication that South India was not a warlike place, or that South India did not have the kind of violence that you see in North India's history, which is simply not the case. And at least as far as I was concerned when I set out to write this book, the intention was very much to move our public understanding of the South into more nuanced territory. Because for so many decades there have been so many complaints that the South is not given its rightful place in our understanding of India's past. When the time has finally come for the South to take its place, as it were, I think it's very important that that history should be told with nuance rather than reduced to these rather simplistic binaries that have become so commonplace in the way we think about history.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I think we were talking about the question of moral ambiguity right before we started the conversation, so we'll come to that, but I just want to pick up on something interesting that you said, that as a South Indian person, when you set out to write the book, so I was wondering, because we have so many, we're in North India, and I'm a North Indian, I would like to say, although, it's complicated for me, but I was just wondering, because we all, India is a very complex space, as you mentioned, it's like Europe with so many countries put together. So just before we move on to the other part of the conversation, I was wondering who, according to you, is a South Indian person? Who is South Indian? Is it someone who lives in South India? Is it someone with South Indian ancestry? Is now, as I discovered that you're living in Delhi, so are you a North Indian now that you're living in Delhi? So how do you think these kind of identities can be negotiated? How do we describe first what is the Deccan, and then who is a South Indian person? What is your opinion on that?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a single answer to that. Because I myself, until relatively recently, was not as aware of South India's history as I should have been. I remember in 2017, when I had just gotten my first job, I walked into one of Bangalore's beautiful old bookstores and I said, "Do you have any books about the Chalukyas and Rashtrakutas?" And they said no. And this is in Bangalore. Bangalore in many ways one of the Deccan's most important cities. And there's this very profound sense of, I think, historical disconnection in southern India. I don't know why exactly that is. I think there are very complex political economic reasons in terms of what we choose to study, what is considered a viable career, all sorts of things. But the end result of that is that people just don't study South India's history in South India. So what really makes someone South Indian? Is it their taste in food? Is it their cultural roots? I would think that is the closest that we can get to a definition. Somebody who likes idlis, dosas, but also somebody who likes Hyderabadi biryani or
I like all of it.
Yes,
I will claim you all for South India.
that is South India today.
But again, I suppose the answer also depends on when and where you're looking. Because I think that in the period that I write about, from 600 to 1200, and really up to fairly recently, perhaps as recently as the 17 or 1800s, there is a very clear sense of regional identities in India that isn't necessarily as strong today because of how cosmopolitan we are, how interconnected we are, because of the fact that we all participate in a shared public commons in a way that simply was not possible in the medieval period. But once again, that's a bit of a complex answer, right? Because one thing that I get into in the book is, for example, this cultural sphere, if you can call it that, called the Sanskrit cosmopolis. And to me, that is like one of the most amazing phenomena of the pre-modern period, because you have in this vast swathe stretching all the way from, at some periods, Afghanistan up to Kashmir, and then all the way down into Southeast Asia, sometimes including Tibet, sometimes even parts of China, and even as far as Japan, where intellectual texts and ideas are being produced in the Sanskrit language. And you have this, you do have some ideas about selfhood, about rulership that are common in all these regions, but at the same time, all these regions have a very clear sense of themselves being culturally distinct. So for example, in Karnataka, you have these texts being composed that take the rules of Sanskrit grammar but apply it to the Kannada language. Similarly, you see, if you look at Cambodia, for example, while a lot of their courtly texts are produced in Sanskrit initially, there's this tendency also to start producing cultural texts in Khmer and to localize the language. And you can see it in Tamil Nadu, where, for example, it's very controversial to Tamil nationalists to say that Sanskrit was something that Tamil kings used. The fact of the matter is that if you look at the text, there is quite a lot of respect and interest in Sanskrit, and they don't really see a dichotomy between participating in the broader Sanskritic world and also being proudly local and proudly Tamil. And I think the best way to understand that is to not really call it a pre-modern world, because these people, you have to keep in mind, did not see themselves as being pre-modern. They didn't see themselves as being medieval. In their minds, they were the most sophisticated people who ever lived. And they were participating in a globalized world. And just as the fact that we are speaking in English does not make us any less Indian, I don't think the fact that these people were speaking Sanskrit made them any less South Indian, made them any less Deccan, made them any less Tamil. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So that was very interesting. And before, as you rightly pointed out, that even as a South Indian person, even if we can call it, put it in quotes, So that you were not aware of the nuances of the history as much. So before we move on to discussing a little bit more about the nuances, so in the book you discuss primarily the three major dynasties, that is the Cholas, the Chalukyas and the Rashtrakutas. So just to kind of, I don't know if everyone in the audience has read the book, so just to kind of give them a little bit of a brief idea about what were these three empires like. So whenever we think of Chola, for me, I just recently watched Ponniyin Selvan. That's the image that kind of keeps replaying in the mind. But so can you just give me, give all of us actually here, a little bit of a brief idea of these three dynasties?
Sure. So the thing I like to start out by saying is that I find architecture to actually be a very useful tool for looking at the medieval world. I think a lot of us today are very used to this idea that a temple is a temple. How much nuance does that contain? But once you actually learn to look at the architecture of a temple, it begins to reveal more and more about the time and place in which it is created.
That's an evidence.
Exactly. It is very much this kind of footprint, this permanent enduring footprint left by a very complex and dynamic society. So if I may, I'd like to actually answer this question using temples. If you were to go to Vatapi today in North Karnataka, you will see these fascinating, possibly some of the earliest Hindu temples south of Narmada that are cut directly into the sandstone cliffs. But they're fairly small, not very complex. And these are really the temples of the early Chalukyas. So the Chalukyas are this dynasty that emerges, as far as we can tell, from absolutely nowhere. They seem to have been some kind of pastoralist or agricultural chieftains who turned to building temples and associating themselves with the gods as a way to distinguish themselves from their peers and to claim this high kind of courtly status. And it is in that context that Sanskrit begins to make its appearance in the Deccan, because just as speaking English in India today automatically sets you apart from most of the populace, as messed up as that is, it was the same in the medieval period, where speaking Sanskrit gave you automatically this great status as participating in this broader world. But roughly around, and so of course the Chalukyas thrived for 200 years or so, until the Rashtrakuta dynasty, who were formerly their underlords, then overthrew them and established their own empire in the Deccan. And to me, the Rashtrakutas are by far the most fascinating people of medieval India, because, and this is a bit of a tangent, so pardon me, Sudhamni, but I think that a very big issue in the way that we think about medieval India is that we want it to conform to our politics today. And so I find Ponniyin Selvan just fascinating, because it is this magnificent offspring of Tamil nationalism and Hindu nationalism, combined with the growing prowess and confidence of Bollywood and Tollywood and all these filmmaking industries. If you look at the way the Cholas are portrayed in Ponniyin Selvan, they are portrayed as essentially Tamil heroes. But this is not the way that the Cholas would have been seen historically, right? If you were to go to the 11th century and ask a Tamil what he thought the Chola king, the answer would depend on what this individual's caste status was. It would depend on where in the Tamil country they were based. So if they were around the Madurai region, they would meet your question with the choicest expletives. Because the Madurai region, which was the Pandya country, was violently, repeatedly conquered by the Cholas. So somebody in the Madurai region, while speaking Tamil, would have seen the Cholas as absolutely antithetical to everything they stood for, right? So there's a quest to select these regional dynasties, to cleanse them of all the historical nuances that they came with, and to portray them as these unitary heroes of modern political identities, right? So Tamil nationalism is not a concept in the 12th century, it's a concept now. And the Cholas have been retrofitted to that modern political concept.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what makes the Rashtrakutas interesting to me is that nobody's managed to do that for them. For the simple reason is that they are Kannada-speaking kings who are ruling in Maharashtra. So the Kannada nationalists don't really want them, and the Marathi nationalists don't really want them. Because where do they fit in? But that precisely exemplifies the issue with how we see the medieval world is that if we try to fit it into our way of thinking, it's just not going to work. So, ending that tangent there, the Rashtrakutas, now coming back to this whole way of seeing them through temples, I don't know how many of you have been to the Kailashanatha temple in Ellora, but I'm sure not a lot of us know that at one point it was perhaps one of the largest structures made by human beings on earth.
Yeah.
It was the only things that were larger than Kailashanatha at its peak were perhaps Hagia Sophia in present day Istanbul, the pyramids of Giza, and maybe one of the Abbasid mosques in Iraq.
And cut from top to bottom.
Yes, it's all cut from a single cliffside that was accomplished within 10 to 12 years, according to a single architectural plan that removed almost 2 million cubic feet of rock from basalt cliff face. And if you were to visit the Kailashanatha today and just please don't listen to the tour guides. One guy was telling me that positive energy comes in from this side of the temple and negative energy goes from that side. Don't listen to those guys. If you just look at it as an architectural and sculptural achievement, you will understand that the people who made it, the Rashtrakutas, saw themselves as the greatest people in the world. There is no sense of that. I think that there's a strange inferiority complex that I think has become very ingrained in the politics today. The Rashtrakutas have none of that. It is amazing to me that if you were to read the travel records of Arabs in the 9th century, they say that there are 4 great kings in the world. Of course, the first is the Caliph. The second is the Emperor of China. The third is the Byzantine Emperor, the Emperor of Rome. And the fourth is the Rashtrakuta Emperor who rules all of India. And this is especially interesting because, I mean, we're so used to thinking that, the Chinese always saw themselves as the center of the world. They thought the world revolved around them. Or, the Arabs saw themselves as the center of the world. They thought the world revolved around them. But if you read Rashtrakuta sources, it's very clear they thought the world revolved around them. They explicitly call themselves fortune's favorite and earth's beloved. They saw themselves as a ruler of this world continent called Jambudvipa. And of course, Jambudvipa today also has its own political connotations. It's seen as corresponding to India, but to the Rashtrakutas, Jambudvipa was the entire world that they were ruling from the world mountain that was the Kailashanatha they had built in the center of India. Who are these people? Why is it that they are not? I mean, you don't know about them. That's why the book exists. Around the late 10th century, the Rashtrakutas find their domination over the world challenged by this upstart dynasty at the time called the Cholas. And once again, it's one of these. What I find so interesting about history is that nothing in history was really preordained. Nothing was inevitable in history. And the Rashtrakutas do this thing that made sense to them in their time, but ended up really biting them in the rear end later. Which is that they go down to Tamil Nadu in about 949. They fight the Cholas, who had been building a kingdom of their own. They fight them, and they kill the Chola crown prince Rajaditya Chola at this battle in 949. Now, Rajaditya was probably he would have been a decent king, but really not a extraordinary world-changing kind of guy. But because he had been killed by the Rashtrakutas, I think this will be his grand-nephew, eventually comes to the throne. A young chap called Arulmozhivarman, who eventually takes the title of Rajaraja Chola and completely destroys the Deccan, which of course makes up the third part of my book. And once again, this Rajaraja Chola is a truly extraordinary character. I mean, imagine if after the Vietnam War, Vietnam, within the space of 10 years, conquered the continental US. That's the kind of complete political reversal we see with Rajaraja Chola. He's one of those individuals that really makes you appreciate how much a single person can change the course of history, because this man comes from essentially nowhere, creates the closest thing to a centralized state that medieval India ever had, embarks on these massive engineering projects, these huge logistics projects, and militarily completely remakes the political landscape from one that was centered in the Deccan to one that is very briefly, but still very concretely anchored in Tamil Nadu. And I find this person so fascinating, and it's a real shame to me that he's been appropriated by these very black and white narratives. And of course, that was my very meandering answer to your question. I hope that gives you all a sense of this fascinating world that I'm so obviously
I absolutely love the meanderings and the tangents that you went on, because that I think is something that I would really like to discuss here. Is that we usually, as you were rightly pointing out, that it would be very different if we had asked someone living at that time what they thought of the kingdoms and the empires that they were living under. So we tend to think of it as something that is set already in time, and that has, we usually, whenever we are discussing history, and that's more and more the case now, particularly in this political climate, is that we tend to glorify the past a lot. We are constantly thinking of the past, we're constantly glorifying it. When we think of the Cholas, as you said, that it's the Ponniyin Selvan, it's a grand thing that we're looking at with jewelry and the architecture and the political battles that they were indulging in. So my question is that when we actually delve into the history, as you said, that one of the motivations of why you wanted to write the book was to get into the nuances of that history. So what do you think that life was like for the common citizenry in those times? Not so much for the kings and not so much for the people who belonged to those particular dynasties, but how was life like for common people under these dynasties? And it kind of ties to another thing that we were also discussing, and is how morally ambiguous do you think it was? And is it a past that we wish to return to? Is any past a past that we wish to return to at all?
To the past.
Yes, exactly, but we tend to glorify it a lot. So my question to you is, what do you think life was like actually, as if I was a citizen under the Chola or the Rashtrakuta kingdom, what would I be feeling like?
There's this very interesting battle that happens in, I think, around 918, 919 CE, where the Sri Lankans actually invade Tamil Nadu, and they are fought off by the Cholas, but it's not like a decisive victory. Okay, so the Sri Lankans are still very much in the game, and they're planning to go back and attack them again when there's an outbreak of smallpox in their camp. And the Sri Lankan prince, who is the leader of the army, just dies of smallpox. And I find that interesting for two reasons. First of all, if the Sri Lankans had gone back and fought the Cholas again, would there have been no Chola Empire? It's one of those things that really makes you think about the inevitability, what really was inevitable in the past. The second reason why I find that interesting is this idea that such an important, wealthy person, a member of undoubtedly the ruling elite, the upper class of this world, could just die of smallpox. We live in a world where smallpox has been eradicated. I'm not sure a lot of us appreciate just what a colossal achievement that is in like a grand historical sense. Because, as you said, ma'am, even though we can't return to the past, I feel like there's this very concerted, very clever attempt to present the past as this kind of idealized place, which it was not. It in no way was it an ideal place. And if a king, if a prince could die so suddenly and so randomly from a disease, just imagine how miserable life was for the vast majority of people. And the really interesting, and to me the really tragic thing about medieval India is that the only sources that survive from the period are inscriptions made by these kings. Right? It's only when a king is going and making a donation to a temple and having that commemorated, so he's having that written down on a copper plate or he's having it carved into the stone of a temple, that's the only source that survives. Imagine if in 3023 CE, somebody is sitting and trying to write a history of our time using only government acts. They're obviously going to come away thinking, oh wow, the government was just amazing and nobody died from COVID-19
Isn't that already the case? A lot of people have already.
But there would be enough material all around.
Of course.
It won't be just government ads.
Yeah, that's exactly. So that is the beauty of living in 2023 is that we have managed to create, and like all of us have a voice now. Every person who lives pretty much is able to put their thoughts out there, at least digitally.
But then you have to be a discerning writer. You can't be social media writer.
Of course. But I feel like that is the tragedy of a lot of writing on medieval India is that so much of the historiography is essentially social media writing. In that you are looking only at the top Twitter influencers and saying, okay, this is how they saw the world, and so that is what history was. But once you really begin to read between the lines, let's say for example, a king says, I'm granting 400 villages to this temple. Now there's two ways to see this. One way, of course, is to say, oh wow, this king was so devout. What a great man.
Benevolent.
Yeah, so benevolent. But then you ask yourself, okay, so but what about the people living in the villages?
Did you ask?
Yeah. Who asked? Did the king take the permission of the people from the villages? Who was going and collecting the rice and the grain from the people in the villages? And then once you think about, okay, so who are the people in the villages? Is everybody owning a piece of land? Or is there, like there was until very recently, a ruling elite that owns all the land and a bunch of landless people who have to pay rent to cultivate those lands? And I think that there is more than enough evidence to suggest that the vast majority of people, and that actually makes up most of our ancestors, right? Because in 3023, not everyone is going to be descended from Elon Musk, right? It's the same logic with these medieval people, is that the royals are essentially the 1% of the 1%, and the vast majority of people are the landless cultivators, the ones who are breaking their backs in the fields, the ones who are vulnerable to aggression from armies. We have so many examples of kings boasting of like burning down cities and burning down villages, and it just truly amazes me is that how these are kind of like swept under the rug or kind of like hand waved away. And I mean, pardon me for getting political, but history is political. But if you were to look at, for example, how people talk about the conquest of the sultans, there is no denying that the sultans could be extremely, extremely violent and did destroy quite a lot of things. But this idea that Hindu kings did not also destroy a lot of things is very strange, because it requires you to ignore what the Hindu kings themselves are telling you, which is that we destroyed things and we were awesome for destroying things.
When you won any other state, you did.
Exactly, and that is the nature of power, right? And that's what I find most interesting and also quite disturbing about this rewriting of our past today, is that it's this fascinating phenomenon, or at least it would be fascinating if I wasn't so terrified of it, of depicting power as being completely benevolent, or at least power when exercised by some individuals as being fundamentally benevolent, but when exercised by other individuals as being completely evil, which I don't think is the lesson that human history teaches us. I think really what history shows us is that, I mean, and I hate to be generic about it, but history shows us that power corrupts. And absolute power that was not constrained by any kind of like democratic process, that was handed by divine right to kings, can and did corrupt absolutely. That is what the historical record shows us again and again through time. And I think it's very important that, especially in the context of medieval South India, that we don't lose sight of this.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's very interesting because whenever we think of the past, we always, at least, I would imagine that most of the people, because there's a concerted effort, as you said, at glorifying that past, at presenting it in a certain way, we tend to forget that we would not necessarily belong to the powerful elite of that time if we were actually living in that time. We could well be the oppressed in those times. So whenever I think it's very important to keep that in mind whenever we're thinking of history. But as you said that, so there are these edicts, there's this one thing that you have to kind of depend on when writing about the history of that time, because there are not many sources. And we have now been able to create, thankfully, in 2023, at least everyone has a voice. Whether we listen to it or not is another question, but everyone has a voice. Social media is one great tool for that. So I would like to know, Anirudh, what are the kind of challenges that you faced while writing history? Because I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, is it possible to write objective history? Or when you were writing history, what were the challenges that you faced as writing it? Because I imagine that you are writing a book undertaking history. If someone else was writing it, it would be different. Why would that be different? If we are citing the same sources, if we are depending on the same kind of books, what do you think as a historian? What are your views on that?
That's a fascinating question.
Interpretations. The historian interprets.
Okay, so I think there's multiple ways to look at the process of writing history, right? So at one level, of course, is historiography and interpretation. I think that the way that I differ from a lot of other history writing in India so far is that I don't think that I am as persuaded by these highly nationalistic and glorifying narratives of the past. And I think a big part of that is to do with the kind of scholarship that I've ended up engaging with, which is that I think regional language scholarship, while it is tremendous in terms of its command of the sources, knowledge of the sources, is very often not as critical and objective because of a, once again, very complex kind of political economic reasons. It has become, given the kind of political dispensations that have, these very nationalist political dispensations that have taken root in various Indian states, I feel like it has sadly been the case that many academics are only able to progress if they align with the existing political dispensation. And I feel like academics in the rest of the world who are writing on India have not been constrained by that same thing. Which means that they can be a lot more critical, a lot more objective because they have a lot more distance from the politics of what they are writing about. And I think that to a great extent, I think if I don't agree completely with all Western historians, I think that their viewpoint has really stayed with me, which is that there's a lot of things that I think we as Indians just accept fairly uncritically as received wisdom. So for example, a king patronized a temple because they were benevolent, or a temple is primarily a religious place and it's not a political place. But if you were to look at, for example, a church in medieval Europe that was built by a medieval European king, then we might be a lot more open to considering that, okay, so maybe there's politics also in the way that this cathedral was built.
King versus the church, it was eternal.
Of course, but then once you bring in that kind of comparative historical approach, where you look at the way that power and architecture and culture and political economy work in other parts of the world, it allows you to this very interesting view of India's past, where you don't seek to engage with it just to make yourself feel good, which I think is a very great danger in writing history. History doesn't exist to make us feel good. History doesn't exist to confirm our biases. If history does not challenge our biases, then we're telling it wrong. Because, thank you. Because history is a much grander phenomenon than any of us can really wrap our heads around. There is room for these endless diversities and creativities and different ways of working and seeing the world that we just cannot wrap our heads around today. I mean, all of us have very great friends who we're very attached to, but how many of us would, if a friend of ours passed away, how many of us would take our own lives? That's not a thing, but a lot of medieval inscriptions talk about the bodyguards of a king gladly committing suicide when the king dies. They believe that they owe the king everything, and once the king is gone, they must kill themselves. And it's easy to see that as, wow, so such an oppressive cultural system. But these people didn't see it as oppressive.
It's your interpretation today, you know.
But see, that's the thing, man. It's what is right. What to them was a completely natural way of seeing the world is completely alien and oppressive to us. And what is liberating and extraordinary to us was to them a fundamental challenge to the entire order of the universe. Right? And it's only when we accept that, when we allow history to speak for itself and to be itself, to allow it to be in a way scary and sometimes alien, that's when you know that you're telling history the way it actually was. In terms of actually putting together a book like this, and I think that's a very interesting question, because it's not like academic histories of the region don't exist. Of course, I owe a tremendous debt to all the historians who have done so much work on the Deccan. But academic histories have a particular way of presenting fact. They are not necessarily as interested in narrative. And from the outset, when I was writing my book, my editor at Juggernaut, Parth Mehrotra, told me that, Anirudh, your competition when you're writing this book is not other historians. Your competition is Netflix. Because it's a matter of a second for someone to just shut the book they're not finding interesting, and then to just open up whatever app they're hooked onto and just lose themselves in that mindlessly. So as I was writing the book, it was very important for me to make the people that I'm talking about real, believable, complex individuals, even if their world and the way they act in that world is to us completely alien. And to kind of show that world from all these different perspectives. So when I was writing my first chapter, of course, for those of us who have read a little bit about this period, we've all heard of Harsha, we've all heard of Pulakeshi, and like everybody's heard of these emperors going at it and so on. But what could be a different way of presenting this? And that got me thinking, right? Because these two armies are approaching each other in a forest. So the animals of the forest must have been in complete terror of hundreds and thousands of people suddenly appearing in their home. And that's where the book begins, where this forest is in terror and birds are flying and elephants are fleeing from all this commotion, and there's these new scents and sounds and trumpets and domesticated animals and like people, the sound and smell and scent that accompanies every second of our history that is so easy for us to forget, right? I feel like one very powerful way of bringing the past to life, and perhaps to an extent I think one of the reasons why we're so taken with the Rajputs or the Mughals is that we have a very clear sense of their world and what it was like to live in that world. And really, when I was writing this book, I wanted to bring that world alive, with the thrilling of the adrenaline and the senses and that sense of wonder and disillusionment and chaos that we all feel with our world. I wanted my readers to experience that in the medieval world.
So maybe just one last question, Anirudh, before we open it up to question and answer. I really, really like what you said about the guard, willingly giving away the life, and we see it as oppressive. It's pretty much the same thing it's the same practice as sati. So it becomes a very complex question whether we can say it was oppressive or not, and it's an extremely complex thing to talk about. But anyway, that's another tangent. I'm sorry to bring that up at all. It's just a thought that occurred to me. But just to kind of wrap up the session, since we are mainly focusing here today on the history of the Deccan and how it has often been overlooked in a certain way, when do you think that happened? Because do you think that the Deccan disappeared from the quote-unquote the narrative? First of all, I do understand that the national narrative, so to say, only began with the rise of the Indian nation state. There was no nation as such before that. So how do you think that the rise of the Indian nation state has played into the overlooking or ignoring the part of the Deccan history? How do you think that kind of plays into it?
I think something that we very much take for granted today, we don't really question it necessarily, is why is it that the borders of our nation state are the way they are today? Because, of course, you have brilliant maps like the one in the Parliament building today that show ancient India having the same boundaries as India today, but that really was not the case. A friend of mine showed me this fascinating map from 1947, actually the day of independence, that was published by the Hindu on their front page, and that showed India as basically consisting only of the United Provinces in North India, parts of Punjab, a few other princely states up to the Narmada also, and of course the Madras Presidency, and the entirety of Hyderabad, big parts of the Malabar coast, big parts of Rajasthan even, were not part of India on 15th August 1947. And over the next year or two, you essentially had this period of political and military consolidation within South Asia that I don't think had been seen since the Mughal Empire, where Nehru, Patel, and a bunch of other brilliant diplomats and bureaucrats just quickly annexed and created the modern day boundaries of India. And once that was created, it was such a diverse place where, keep in mind, for many people who had lived in princely states all their lives, many people had actually petitioned for their princely state to stay independent. So Travancore, for example, saw itself as being an independent city-state akin to Singapore within South Asia. And the people of Travancore didn't necessarily want to be completely integrated as a state of India. Now, when you have a nation like that, and you have universal adult suffrage, and you also have the ability to create a single education system, I think it was very important for our post-independence politicians to create this idea that no, even if we have just been politically united now, our histories have all been the same. But in order to say that, they had to be selective in what histories they were teaching to people. And so inevitably what happened was that the focus of history became what I call imperial moments, where very briefly, and if you look at the grand scheme of India's history, the moments where a single empire dominates the rest of the regions are actually very few and far between. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the history textbooks, at least up till very recently, which is a whole other thing, used to focus on the Mauryas, on the Guptas, on the Delhi Sultanate, on the Mughals, on the British, on the few powers that for a few decades managed to control most of the subcontinent. But in the process, and I fully understand why that was important in the 50s, but I feel that at some point we became complacent about the past, and the purpose really of teaching history became to instill, I think when the purpose of history is to instill a sense of patriotism and nationalism, rather than instilling a sense of how to think about historical change, how to think about power, and how to think about what happens when power is not restrained. I think once that happens, then we're on a very slippery slope. And that has been politically convenient, not just for this government, but for many governments before that. But the tragedy of that is that we're paying a price today where so many people are convinced that history exists only to confirm nationalism. And I've had some very interesting run-ins with nationalists online. And pardon me for sharing my personal experiences, but I do write a lot about the Cholas because, as I said, I find them completely fascinating, and I wish that they would be represented with a little more nuance and allowed to speak for themselves in the way that we see the past. But this inevitably means that I must also speak about violence, because violence was important to the fashioning of kingship and of royal identity, as it is throughout time. But when I point this out, I have been told in no uncertain terms by a number of Twitter activists that because I'm Telugu and I was conquered by the Cholas, I'm jealous of them, and that is why I'm saying these things. But that's not the case. I mean, I feel that it's a tragedy that our curiosity about the past has been hijacked by political actors who want to use history to create emotions. And I feel that as citizens, if we want to hold not just this government but all governments accountable, we owe it to ourselves to understand the way that power operates. And if we want to learn how power operates, rather than read about histories of Europe or histories of China, we should read our own histories, because our own histories can teach us that in a way that no other part of the world can. And the more we ignore that, the more we try to shoehorn our past into this binary narrative, the more violence we're inflicting upon it. And it's so tragic that in the name of rescuing the past, we are actually inflicting upon it a violence far more acute than even the British ever did.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting point to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much.
Yes, please, absolutely.
Oh my God, that was such an interesting, deep, complex, but very, very challenging discourse.
Thank you.
And I have several differences. I'm glad that you said history is political. I'm glad that you raised the question of objectivity, you know. So a writer, an author, what he writes, what he ignores, what he deliberately ignores while writing, what he overemphasizes. I mean, I can see the ideological prejudices of yours. You can just read them, you know. So my straight question is, very simple question actually. Would you write a history on North India? Because Dalit scholars writing about Dalit issues, women scholars writing about women problems, or South Indian writing about, that makes it very, very subjective. So very, very simple question. Would you ever write a book on North India and its, you know, problems? Yeah.
Let him answer.
As I said about our tendency towards regional nationalism, right? We think of history as existing in silos. So we think of Tamil history as belonging to Tamils, the Deccan history as belonging to Deccanese. But one thing I do try to do very consciously in the book is to talk about the interconnections of history, right? So I take a lot of time to talk about, okay, so this is what's happening in Deccan at the time, but this is what's happening in Arabia. This is what's happening in Europe, this is what's happening in China, because all our histories are interconnected. We have all evolved together, and the history of any part of the world belongs to all of us humans as our common heritage, right? So while I'm not sure that I have the expertise to write exclusively, specifically about North India, I do think that there are a lot of instances where North India's interactions with South India are more complex than we otherwise think. And those are things that I do want to write about. So for example, what exactly was the Delhi Sultanate up to in South India? What do the sources actually tell us, and what can they reveal if allowed to speak for themselves? So that's one example. I don't think that I would necessarily sit and write a history of the Mughals. I don't really have the qualifications for that. But insofar as South India's history is intertwined in North India's, I absolutely would write about that.
Well, you and I can go on discussing the matter for a long time. I haven't done my master's in history of ancient India and Indian culture, and I wonder if you ever read E.H. Carr, the book which says what is history, and which says objectivity and subjectivity, where they come, what is fact, what is pulp, and what is the core. So that's where the subjectivity does interfere when she says, as a South Indian or a person from that side, you are on an easier wicket to play, you know. But I wonder, have you done history, which part of history as your academics, what did you do? Did you do any of the history of medieval India? Because the portion that you relate to, and you call it medieval history, we have early medieval period, we have ancient Indian history because of Harsh, and that's how we come to Cholas and Chalukyas and Rashtrakutas. My contention as a history student, of course, I did history at a time, and I would think even today, the masters in history would not be dictated by politics. It is history of people who have written it, and it would always be of the kings, because kings were carving the empires and dictating the destiny of the people. Then it is for you to interpret what is this what was the people's situation. About the sources, what about the literary sources? What about numismatics? What about, you just went on architecture, but there must be so many literary sources as well.
Absolutely, that's actually something I engaged with in the book quite extensively. So one of my biggest sources was the Yashastilaka, of course, the medieval Deccan Jain text, and of course the early medieval, if we're being precise, because the medieval extends from 600 to 1500 depending on which scholar you're looking at. So it's really a very long period. I of course use a lot of literature. There is a Yashastilaka. When I'm looking at Pallavas, for example, I use the plays were written by Mahendra Varman. Numismatics, I look at some very interesting Rashtrakuta gold coins that have been discovered,
Exactly.
Including the dinaras of Govinda III and so on. So I think that what I really tried to do in the book is be as interdisciplinary as possible, because over-relying on any single source of evidence really skews the way we think about the past. And I think one really big issue and one major way in which we lag behind contemporary Europe is in archaeology, because archaeology in India is focused quite a lot on ancient India, but not so much on the medieval period, which is an issue, because one very interesting scholar who has been working on Anuradhapura recently, a gentleman called, I think, K. Strickland. Anuradhapura, of course, the Cholas claim to have destroyed it. The Chola Vamsa, which is a Sri Lankan chronicle, claims that the Cholas ripped open the stupas like blood-sucking yakshas, which is like quite graphic. But when Professor Strickland went to do the archaeology there, he found that there isn't a lot of evidence of the Cholas actually committing mass destruction. The reason why Anuradhapura declined is because the Cholas established a new capital, Polonnaruwa. Now, this is interesting because is it the case that the Cholas actually didn't destroy things, or is it because the evidence of the destruction has faded away over the last 1,000 years? The only way we can know that is if we look at the archaeology of various Deccan sites. If you look at Manyaketa, which is the Rashtrakuta capital, which the Cholas claim to destroy, then we get a better understanding of really what was the extent of medieval violence. But until the government sees fit to fund that, we have to rely on the other sources we have. So, hope that answers the question.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for such a lovely session. As an author, I would like to know something, like you're writing something which is never written. You're rewriting the past or you're rewriting history. So you don't have much of research material. So how do you validate it to yourself? Of course, when the book is out, there are some conflicts of opinion or something. But as an author, where do you feel that, yes, I am validating what I am writing, I am contented with the history research that I've done? How do you go about it?
Thank you. So, of course, it's very important to me to make sure that my arguments and my interpretations are based on solid facts. So, the way that I approached Lords of the Deccan was to first look at the work of earlier historians. So I looked at, for example, R.C. Majumdar, looked at Durga Prasad Dikshit and a bunch of other historians, and I looked at their interpretations of the same evidence, and then I looked at that very same evidence with the benefit of, the last century of like historiographical, theoretical developments, and I said, okay, does this necessarily hold up? And I found that in a lot of cases, what these historians were saying, which has been received as, the established wisdom of the centuries by us today, was actually debated even in their own time. And so that encouraged me to, I think, be bold in challenging establishing narratives. But if you see the bibliography of the book, if you see the number of footnotes, my editor almost like, he gave me hell for the sheer, like the last fifth of the book is just my footnotes. So they're there for two reasons. Firstly, because I want to establish that what I'm saying is based on hard evidence, but also because I want other people to look at the evidence that I'm citing and see if they agree with it or not. Because historiography, history, or any kind of academia, any kind of academic endeavor dies when we're not questioning things. And it has become all too common in all fields of academia in India to say, okay, this professor said this, so I'm not going to question it. But that is so important. How is our knowledge of the past going to advance if evidence and interpretations don't evolve more critically in dialogue with each other? So I hope that answers your question. But if for example, as an author, if you would like to write about a period, if you disagree with my interpretation of the past, I would absolutely encourage it. I would love to change. I would love to change my opinions if new research comes out, but I mean, I don't want to repeat myself, but that is how knowledge advances. I'm not saying that anybody's word is the final word on the period that I write about.
Thank you so much, Anirudh. We could, as you can see, go on and on and on. And thank you, Sudhamni, for brilliantly moderating the session. I'm going to request Mr. Rana to please come up and present the mementos to our author and our moderator.
This is how it is done. Yeah, look at
Kanisetti